For most photo and video shooters, the 85mm lens is a lens they buy much later in their creative journey. And almost everyone I talk to talks about their life before and after the 85mm. And I think the thing that holds most people back is the price, because even an affordable 85mm isn't all that cheap in the scheme of affordable lenses. And this new release lens seeks to change that by coming in at a price that is about half the price of the Sony 85mm f1.8. And in real world results, you're not even going to be able to tell the difference. And what an 85mm lens lacks in versatility, it makes up for in dramatic image quality. And I think a lot of people out there, when they think of professional photos, they think of blurry backgrounds, they think of compressed images. And the 85mm lens, an 85 f1.8 or f1.4, is going to get you these dramatic images that you're used to seeing out of professional photography. And it's a perfect lens, particularly for portrait photography, but also product photography, food photography, and I even love to use it for street photography. So if the thing you're looking for out of your photos or out of your videos is more dramatic images, the 85mm f1.8 is an absolutely default option. An 85mm f1.8 is also going to be an excellent low light lens because f1.8 is a quite wide maximum aperture. That's going to allow a lot more light in. This is going to get you a much cleaner image in low light situations. So if you're in a city at night shooting at street lights or dark environments or historic buildings, you're going to get a much cleaner image by using a lens like this that goes to a maximum of f1.8. This new release lens is an 85mm f1.8 by 7 Artisans. It comes in at about half the price of the comparable Sony option. I'll put a couple links in the description down below to the 2 best prices that I could find on the lens. And in full disclosure, this lens was sent out to me at no cost to myself. This is not a paid or sponsored video, and 7 Artisans had no say in the making of the video. When you see an 85mm f1.8 lens come in at the price point we're talking about with this lens, the first thing that you're going to assume is that you are going to get a poor build quality. And I can tell you that that is absolutely not the case. This is an all metal lens. It's based on a metal lens mount. It has the ability to update the firmware via USB-C port. It's also quite a feature-rich lens for a budget lens. You've got an aperture ring, a smooth turning aperture ring. It's a declicked aperture ring. You've got an autofocus manual focus switch, which is nice and stiff and not easy to bump out of place. And it also has a programmable function button on the lens. It has a very smooth and stiff turning focus ring, and the focus control is excellent on this lens if you are doing manual focus. It also comes with a simple plastic lens hood. And as you can see, the lens overall is just an excellent build quality, far exceeding the price point. This is only 7 Artisans' third autofocus lens, so I think you would be justified in worrying about how the autofocus performance is going to be. And I would say it is about 80% of the comparable Sony option. When things aren't moving quickly and you're just doing portraits, product photography, food, things like this, it is absolutely spot on. The only place that I did find it to fail at times or slightly misfocus is when objects are moving very quickly or I'm throwing the camera around in street photography. I successfully used the camera in a number of street photography situations and had no problem, but I think my overall hit rate and the keeper rate was lower than it would have been on the comparable Sony by probably about 20%. Looking at static subjects like product photography, food photography, or portrait photography, you're not going to find any difference between this lens and the native Sony lens. Another place that budget lenses often suffer is control of distortion. This lens has almost no distortion whatsoever. When I looked very closely, I could see that maybe there was the slightest amount of pincushion distortion, but in any real world shots, unless you're trying to get a straight edge close to the edge of frame and actually looking for the distortion, there really is none. Another worry with fast lenses at this price point is chromatic aberration, and that is color fringing around high contrast scenes in the in-focus areas. This lens exhibited essentially no chromatic aberration whatsoever. I even put it in a number of challenging situations, and I just really couldn't find any. Now, the place that you do see a little bit of chromatic aberration is in the out of focus areas. This is a change in color cast before and after the plane of focus. It does exhibit a moderate amount of this longitudinal chromatic aberration or out of focus chromatic aberration, but I don't think it's anything that will have any significant impact on real world shooting. The flare performance on this lens is a little bit of a mixed bag, and it's the one place that the native Sony lens will potentially exceed the performance of this lens. When you have direct light coming into the lens and that bright light is in the image frame, it actually controls it incredibly well. You get a little bit of blooming, but you don't get a lot of desaturation or washing out of the image. What you do get is when you have bright lights just out of frame, you get this sort of blooming or flashing where you get this sort of wash of decontrast over a part of the image. Now, this isn't terrible, and in real world shooting, when it showed up, all I did was have to change the angle of the camera a tiny bit or which way the lens was aiming to get rid of it. But it is something that's there, and it is something that I don't think you're going to see in the native Sony lens. The lens exhibits a typical amount of vignette for an 85mm f1.8 lens. It's reasonably strong at f1.8, much decreased by f2.8, and completely gone somewhere between f4 and f5.6. And I think this is a typical and reasonable performance for the lens. For an 85mm lens, the lens also has quite a good close minimum focus distance. And when you are close, you do get reasonably good image quality. I will say that I think the image quality improves as you stop it down a bit. So if you are shooting close-up images, shooting at f4 and beyond is probably better than shooting at f1.8. But if you're doing product photography or food photography or anything like that, you're probably going to be shooting at f4 and beyond anyways. So I think it's an excellent close-up lens for those types of shots. One of the strongest characters from this lens is its ability to render sharpness and detail. And the sharpness out of this lens right from f1.8 is absolutely razor sharp and high contrast. As you get to the corners are a little bit soft and they lose a little bit of detail. Nothing that I would worry about. And particularly with an 85mm lens, I absolutely don't worry about the corners at all, because with the type of images I'm capturing, I'm not putting anything in the corner that I'm hoping for the viewer to look at. The entire image when I'm shooting an 85mm lens is going to fall somewhere in the middle 3/4 of the image frame. And this lens is razor sharp in that area. So a little bit softer in the corner than maybe some of the competitors, but nothing that I worry about when we're talking about the typical uses of this lens. Looking at bokeh and background blur, which I think for a lens like this is as important, if not more important than sharpness and detail, where you're probably going to be shooting it wide open a lot for things like portraits, where you want to draw the viewer's eye to the thing that's in focus, and you want that out of focus area just to provide a smooth, dreamy backdrop to what you're getting the viewer to look at in somewhere in the middle 3/4 of frame. And this lens renders some absolutely beautiful bokeh and background blur. You do get some cat's eye shaped bokeh as you get to the corner of frame, which is something that I don't mind at all. It kind of gives it a little bit of a swirly bokeh effect. And you often see this in very expensive lenses anyways. And the background blur is just smooth and dreamy. I'm not getting any jagged, distracting edges. And in all my real world shooting, I thought the background blur was probably maybe an 8 or a 9 out of 10. So if you're a new photo or video shooter and you don't have an 85mm lens, this is probably one of the biggest things you can do to improve the dramatic look of your photos and videos. And 85mm lenses almost always capture these images that just make everybody go, wow. And when they see them, they think of images that are taken by professional photographers. And that's because most professional photographers use an 85mm lens a lot more than the average amateur photographer. Now, if you're considering this lens as your first 85mm lens, you should also consider this lens. This is the Yongnuo 85mm f1.8. It is a little bit more expensive, but it is considered the sharpest budget lens ever made.